Welcome to the Art of Living Free series with Anthony Silard. We would love your support to keep these valuable videos and podcasts free for everyone. To make a donation, please visit theartoflivingfree.org. 100% of all proceeds go to nonprofit education programs. Today, Dr. Silard explores how we have changed with 1 year in quarantine.
Hello, I'm Anthony Silard and welcome to the Art of Living Free. So today we're going to talk about 1 year in the quarantine. How have we changed? So as we approach this 1 year anniversary of the pandemic, you may be watching this before the anniversary or after, but it's still going to hold the same. There's a question we need to ask ourselves. How will we emerge from this pandemic? So in other words, how will we be different, if at all, from when the pandemic began? Right? When this protracted period of social isolation and this fear and anxiety, worry around contracting this deadly virus, this last year, how will we be different as human beings? So let's take a look at how we've changed. So far, it's not looking very good, this sort of state of the union of our psychological, emotional, social state since the pandemic began. So I'm going to go over 5 ways that we've changed. Okay, here is the first one. We've become lonelier. So before the pandemic, in 2018, January 2018, Cigna ran a survey of over 10,000 adults. They found that 43% were lonely, based on the UCLA Revised Loneliness Scale. 2 years later, in January 2020, just before the pandemic began, Cigna conducted a similar survey and released it. This time, the percentage of Americans who were lonely had increased from 43% to 61%. So before the pandemic, over 3 in 5 of us were lonely. This was in the United States, but this is a global phenomenon. There have been loneliness studies with similar results all over the globe. In Britain, for example, former Prime Minister Theresa May hired a minister for loneliness in 2018. Why did she do that? She did it after reading a study that found that British children were spending less time outside than prison inmates. Really. So this has been a global epidemic, and of course, the social isolation associated with the pandemic has only compounded it. We've also become more anxious. So during the pandemic, during the quarantine, the social isolation, emotions expand and magnify. We have more time to ruminate over our emotions. So for this reason, among others, anxiety is now triple what it was a year ago, the anxiety levels in the United States. So anxiety was described by the Berkeley psychologist Richard Lazarus as an existential emotion because it's associated with perceived threats to our existence. But here's the kicker. What creates anxiety, for example, fear will come from a very clear threat to our existence. Like if a snake is slithering toward me and I jump up on a chair, that's fear from a very, very real threat right in front of me that I can identify. But when the threat is difficult to identify, that's where it becomes anxiety rather than fear, which tends to be a lower level, lower arousal or intensity emotion, but a negative emotion that is much more persistent than fear. Now, anxiety can be very problematic, especially in a pandemic, because none of us want to contract the virus. And so we're always making these choices every day. Okay, should I see this friend? Should I go to the supermarket? Should I take my kids out to play in the park? All these kinds of, or I'm single, and should I go meet someone and maybe have the opportunity for a relationship? All of these kinds of decisions can produce a tremendous amount of anxiety in the pandemic. So we become much more anxious. So the problem when our anxiety is continually high is that we over-release pro-inflammatory cytokine, which as Dr. Keltner, the Berkeley psychologist, has found can cause our immune systems to break down. So feeling anxiety for a protracted period, such as during this pandemic, can have all kinds of physiological effects on our bodies that we don't want. Okay, the third change that many of us have experienced is we become more depressed. So it's important when we think about depression to understand that depression is different from loneliness or anxiety. Let's take the distinction between loneliness and depression. So we have these prototypical scripts around loneliness and depression, for example. When we think to ourselves, I wish my social relationships were more meaningful than they are, that produces loneliness. Whereas with depression, we tend to think, I wish my life were more meaningful than it is. And then another script kicks in, and I feel unworthy to change that. So the big challenge with depression is that it's not just that there's events happening around us that we don't like. That causes a negative emotion, such as sadness. But when it becomes depression, it's because there's a second appraisal or evaluation of what's going on around us, which is, and I don't know how to change it. I feel powerless, helpless. So in one of my articles, I write that depression is loneliness that's given up hope. Right? And this is happening for many people during this pandemic, and this is part, unfortunately, of our State of the Union. Okay, fourth change for our sort of psychological and social emotional State of the Union is we become more polarized. I wrote an article called What Obama and Trump Have in Common. You want to guess what they have in common? Each of them was leading half the country. That's not a healthy state we want to continue for a long time. Because what happens, first of all, polarization, of course, leads to conflict, war, and so on, and violence. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that when we're polarized, we feel lonelier. You know, we feel like others are against us. And we have this, not only are we against many people, but the people that we're with, the in-group, is just a cognitive association because we're not meeting with them during the pandemic. And so this creates a lot of loneliness, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of depression. So what would we say then of these four changes we've experienced? We've become lonelier, more anxious, more depressed, more polarized. What is the common, let's say, factor that in all of these four? And I would say it's disconnection. That we're feeling less connected from each other, and that causes, because there's a lot of studies showing loneliness, depression, anxiety, trauma, and of course polarization. They're all reduced by social connection, meaningful connections with others, meaningful relationships. So that's kind of what we need to build right now. In fact, if you look at the happiness research, or research on well-being, one of the only things that all the researchers in that field agree on is that social connection increases it. The more connected we are with people with our family and friends, people in our community, the happier we are. Okay, so our State of the Union is not looking very good, right? Now comes time for the fifth change. And this is a behavioral change that I propose can improve all of the other four. In fact, basically, if social connection is the closest we have to a panacea to turn our lives around, to turn society around, then here's how we can have more of it, okay? So here's what I want to propose. Stop looking for social connection online. It does not work. When we go online seeking social connection, as I outline in my book, Screened In, The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, when we go online seeking social connection, we end up with social information. Social connection, as I said, it's a buffer against loneliness, depression, anxiety, polarization, all of these societal and personal ills or malaises. Social connection buffers against all of them. Social information does not. So what happens when we get social information? We get the inflated social information from people that really, most of them are not our friends. They're people that we went to high school with or we were coworkers once, and we stopped communicating with them for a reason because they're not in our close circle of friends or family. And yet they're sharing all this information about, you know, the one moment in their week-long family vacation where everyone is smiling. Men try to make themselves look stronger. Women try to use shrinking software to look thinner. It's this massive collective game of self-presentation and impression management that does nothing but make us feel worse about ourselves. So how can we do that? Stop texting, stop chatting, stop Zooming, and start connecting in real time with people. Now, how to do that? Well, first thing is pick up the phone and use it as a phone, right? Call people. So Leslie Seltzer did a study at the University of Wisconsin, fascinating study, where she found that whether it's phone communication or in-person, face-to-face communication, that both of them result in similar increases in oxytocin, which is this neuropeptide associated with bonding and connection, and also a reduction in cortisol, which is associated with stress. It's a stress hormone. So essentially, whether it's phone call or in-person interaction, we feel less stressed and we feel more connected with people. Then Seltzer, outdoing herself, a year later with her team at University of Wisconsin, they said, let's see if electronic communication produces the same outcomes as phone and in-person. And guess what? It didn't produce anything. The electronic communication, texting, chatting, produced zero increase in oxytocin, a sense of neurochemical associated with bonding, and zero decrease in cortisol or stress. So we go online seeking social connection, but we don't get it. We get social information. That's why a study in Germany found that the #1 reported emotion of Facebook users is, you want to guess? I'm pausing so you can guess. Envy, right? Because we're just seeing what others want to show us in their very carefully, meticulously curated versions of themselves that are not real. So not only does going online reduce social connection, but it displaces it. There have been a number of studies that have found that the more time you spend online, the less time you spend with family, friends, and people in your community. So that creates an immense challenge. For example, even another study found that women who are breast cancer survivors, when they form support groups, that when they form their support groups in person, weekly, getting together in person, none of those women were depressed. Whereas when they formed their support group online, 92% of those women were depressed. So that's the displacement effect. Instead of going to even a support group online, go talk with someone in person. That seems to be what the lesson is. So how to do that in a pandemic? Well, again, phone has about the same effects as in person, but not quite. In person is always the best. Now, if you're going to go in person, of course, wear a mask, social distance, and do it safely. And as the world opens up, parlay those phone calls and those mask-wearing kind of awkward social interactions into more social interactions that will hopefully soon be unmasked and free, involve hugging and all the other things that we need as human beings to connect.
Life offers us many challenges, and the artoflivingfree.org offers new ways of thinking so we can see these challenges from a new angle and overcome them. Whether it's Anthony Silard's free blog, video or podcast series, his book, Screened In: The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, or personalized courses, the artoflivingfree.org will help you refine your life vision and then transform it into action. Find out more at theartoflivingfree.org.